Deep in a narrow cave, far from daylight, bones were found that quietly disturb a simple idea, that being human was always a straight climb toward bigger brains, better tools, and clearer dominance. Here was a body that seemed close to us in some ways, distant in others, and still difficult to place without forcing the evidence too far. If evolution can preserve forms of humanity that do not fit our favourite story, what else have we forgotten about our own beginning? Deep inside a cave, did scientists find a species that defies everything we know about humans? Imagine the cave before it had a name in the story of human origins. Above it, the South African landscape lies under ordinary light, with grass, stone, and distant hills shaped by weather older than memory. Nothing on the surface announces that a difficult question is waiting below. The entrance does not open like a grand doorway into the past. It narrows, turns, and lowers the body into darkness. To move through such a place, a person must give up the easy posture of daylight. The shoulders angle inward. The hands search for edges of rock. The breath becomes slower, not because the cave is alive, but because the body knows it is entering a space where one wrong movement matters. That physical difficulty is important. The bones later found deep inside were not resting beside an open riverbank, not scattered across a wide plain, not lying where wind, flood, or grazing animals would easily carry remains. They came from a chamber reached only through a demanding passage. Before any claim about behavior, intelligence, ritual, or meaning can be made, the place itself asks a quieter question. How did the remains of many individuals come to be so far from the ordinary world above? The species now called Homo naledi was first described from fossils recovered in the Rising Star cave system. The name may sound like a label placed neatly on a museum drawer, but the discovery did not arrive neatly. It arrived as fragments, teeth, jaws, hands, feet, ribs, skull pieces, and long bones, enough to suggest a population rather than a single strange body. In the long study of human beginnings, such abundance is rare. Many ancient relatives are known from small pieces, sometimes a jaw, sometimes a skull, sometimes a handful of bones shaped by chance. Here, the difficulty was almost the opposite. There was enough material to see a pattern, yet the pattern did not fit comfortably into a simple ladder of progress. The body carried signs that seemed familiar to the human line, and signs that looked older, as if different pages of evolution had been preserved in one form. For a sleep-bound mind, the cave can be understood not as a place of horror, but as a place where certainty becomes softer. Human origins are often imagined as a climb, smaller to larger, crude to refined, primitive to advanced. That picture is easy to remember, but nature has never promised to follow a straight road for our convenience. Evolution works through populations living in real environments, with bodies shaped by movement, food, birth, survival, isolation, and time. A hand may change while a shoulder keeps an older shape. A foot may become suited to long walking while other traits remain unexpected. A skull may challenge the assumption that a large brain is the single doorway into humanity. In this cave, the beginning of our own story is not replaced, but unsettled. Homo naledi is not treated here as a direct ancestor of modern humans, because the evidence does not require that conclusion. It is more useful and more honest to see it as one branch in a wider human family, a family that once held more variety than the living world now shows. The chamber below the surface reminds us that the past did not exist in order to become us. It was full of its own bodies, its own limits, its own vanished generations. When scientists entered that dark system and brought the fossils into careful study, they did not simply add another name to prehistory. They exposed a weakness in a comforting idea. The human story may not be a single path upward, but a landscape of paths, some crossing, some ending, some leaving only bones in stone. And at the entrance to that thought, the cave remains silent, holding the question without giving the answer back to us quite yet. The first mystery of Rising Star is not only the bones, but the distance between the bones and the world where life normally happens. Most animals die in places connected to water, food, shelter, or danger. Bodies fall near river edges, in open ground, in dens, under cliffs, or along paths where predators and scavengers move. Over long periods, water can shift remains, soil can cover them, teeth can break them. Sun and weather can erase the soft shape of a living being until only mineral traces remain. A cave may preserve what the surface destroys, but preservation alone does not explain every cave. Each underground space has its own shape, and shape matters. In the rising star system, the path toward the fossil chamber is narrow, awkward, and difficult. It does not invite casual movement. It asks the body to bend, squeeze, climb, and continue without the guidance of daylight. That fact does not prove a single story, but it prevents the easier stories from feeling complete. If the remains had washed in through a wide opening, the question would be simpler. If they had been dragged by large predators, we might expect clearer signs of chewing, sorting, or accumulation by animals. If one body had fallen by accident, the discovery would still be important, but less troubling. Instead, the fossils represent many individuals, including younger and older bodies, gathered in a deep chamber that does not look like an ordinary living floor. The beginning of the human story has always been tied to place. Our lineage did not arise as an idea floating above the land. It came from bodies moving through African environments, over stone, under sun, near water, among other animals, through changing climates and changing pressures. For that reason, the position of bones is never just a background detail. It is part of the evidence. A tooth in one layer, a skull in another, a burned fragment near tools, a skeleton in a chamber, beyond reach of light. Each location narrows some possibilities and opens others. With Homo naledi, the cave does not allow a quick answer. It gives us enough to question, but not enough to turn mystery into certainty. This is where careful science becomes quieter than the title might suggest. The species appears to belong within the broad human group called Homo, yet it does not behave, in the fossil record, like a simple stepping stone toward us. Its remains ask about access, movement, group structure, and the strange survival of a body plan that does not match the old expectation that every later human relative must look more and more like ourselves. The cave also changes the emotional shape of the question. On the surface, evolution can seem like an open landscape of expansion. Feet walking farther, hands making more, brains solving more. Underground, the story becomes narrower. The body is brought back to its limits. A large animal cannot easily pass. A careless movement can trap a shoulder or foot. Darkness removes distance. Sound changes. The space asks us to imagine not drama, but constraint. Any ancient body that reached such a place had to pass through real stone, real angles, and real darkness. We should not pretend to know what those individuals experienced. We cannot borrow their thoughts. Yet the physical setting remains, and the setting is enough to unsettle the simple picture. Deep in the cave, the question of human origins is no longer only about what a skull looked like. It is about how bodies moved, how remains accumulated, and how a branch of the human family could leave such a difficult trace in such a hidden place. The cave, before it explains anything, teaches restraint. It reminds us that the origin of humans is not only written in bones, but also in the spaces where bones are found. A discovery can change science in two different ways. Sometimes it gives a clean answer to an old question. More often, it makes the old question too small. The fossils from Rising Star belong more to the second kind. They do not simply ask where one ancient species should be placed on a family tree. They ask why the tree itself is so often imagined as narrow, tidy, and moving toward a single surviving form. When people hear that a species was found deep inside a cave and seem to defy what we know about humans, the mind may look for one dramatic secret, but the deeper disturbance is not a single shocking feature. It is the combination of place, body, and time. The cave places the remains away from ordinary daylight. The body combines traits that do not sit easily in a straight line of progress. The wider human story reminds us that our own species is only the last living branch of a once broader family. Nothing in that statement needs to be exaggerated. It is already enough. The origin of humans becomes less like a ladder and more like a quiet landscape after rain, where many tracks cross, fade, and disappear before anyone can follow them to the end. Homo naledi matters because it stands near the edge of our habits of thought. For a long time, many popular stories of human evolution leaned on a comfortable sequence. Older forms had smaller brains and simpler bodies. Later forms had larger brains and more human-like ways of life. And eventually modern humans appeared as the natural outcome. Scientists have always known the real picture is more complicated, but simple pictures travel easily. They are easy to teach, easy to remember, and easy to place in a straight line. Rising Star resists that ease. It reminds us that evolution is not a moral ascent. A species can preserve older traits while developing other traits in a different direction. A body can be successful enough to leave generations behind without fitting our expectation of what success should look like. A brain can be small by modern standards and still belong to a creature inside the human family, forcing us to be careful about what we think brain size alone can explain. This does not mean every mystery should be filled with imagination. It means the evidence has to be allowed to stay difficult. The cave also reminds us that the beginning of humanity was not a private story belonging only to Homo sapiens. Before the world became a world of one human species, there were other human relatives, each shaped by its own environment and history. Some lived earlier, some overlapped in time, and some are known only through remains that survived by chance. In that larger setting, Homo naledi becomes a sign of lost variety. It does not have to be our ancestor to matter. A cousin can still change how a family understands itself. A vanished branch can still reveal that the trunk was not as simple as it looked from the present. When the listener returns in thought to the cave, the chamber is no longer just a hidden room of bones. It becomes a reminder that human origins are partly known through absence. We do not have every body, every population, every migration, every experiment nature once allowed. We have fragments preserved by geology, found by people, and interpreted with caution. That caution is not a weakness. It is the reason the story can be trusted. Deep underground, the fossils do not announce a final answer. They ask us to begin again with a slower question. What counts as human when the past gives us a form that is near enough to recognize, yet distant enough to unsettle the story we once preferred? And that unsettled space is where the real inquiry quietly begins again now. The body of Homo naledi is difficult to hold in one simple image. If we look only for something ancient, we find features that seem to reach back toward older members of the human family. If we look only for something familiar, we also find signs that feel unexpectedly close to us. The trouble begins when both impressions appear in the same skeleton. A skull may suggest one direction, a foot may suggest another, a hand may seem suited to careful gripping, while the shoulder and trunk may preserve echoes of a body that still knew climbing well. This is why the discovery feels so important for the question of human origins. It does not merely add another creature to a list. It asks us to stop imagining evolution as if every part of the body changes at the same speed, toward the same goal, under the same pressure. Living bodies are not built like machines replaced piece by piece in a fixed order. They are inherited compromises. They carry older solutions into newer circumstances. They keep what still works, alter what must change, and sometimes preserve combinations that later observers find surprising. Homo naledi seems to sit inside that difficult truth. Its body does not ask to be forced into a clean category of primitive or advanced. Those words are too blunt for what the bones show. A more careful way to see it is as a mosaic, a body made from features with different evolutionary histories, all belonging to one real population that once moved, grew, aged, and died. For modern humans, this can feel unsettling because we often want our own origin to look organized from the beginning. We want the path to be visible, first this, then that, then us. But the deeper record of humanity rarely behaves so neatly. The foot of Homo naledi is often described as relatively human-like in important ways, suggesting a creature that could move on two legs with a gait not entirely alien to our own. Yet other parts of the body complicate the picture. Curved fingers may point toward powerful grasping. The shoulders may not match the clean expectation of a fully modern upper body. The pelvis and rib cage have their own older-looking signals. None of these details should be turned into a story of exactly how it lived from morning to night. Fossils do not give that kind of permission, but they do show that the origin of humans was not a single package delivered all at once. Walking, grasping, climbing, carrying, seeing, eating, and thinking could each follow their own pressures, their own timing, their own histories. The cave deepens that lesson. These bones were not found as an abstract diagram in a textbook. They came from a real chamber, inside real stone, after real bodies had somehow entered or been placed there. When we connect the cave to the body, the question becomes more precise. What kind of hominin could carry such a mixture of traits and still belong within the wider human story? What does it mean if a small-brained species could have feet that speak of long, upright movement, hands that raise questions about manipulation, and older features that refuse to vanish simply because later humans prefer a smoother story? The answer is not that everything we knew was wrong. That would be too easy and not careful enough. The answer is quieter. Our knowledge was incomplete, and perhaps still is. Homo naledi makes the beginning of humanity feel less like a straight corridor and more like the cave itself, narrow in places, branching in darkness, preserving traces that only become meaningful when we move slowly, without assuming the path has already been fully seen. From that darkness, the first human questions return to the body itself, because every origin story must pass through bone, movement, breath, and limitation before becoming an idea. A mosaic body is not confusing because it is random. It is confusing because it is organized in a way our expectations were not prepared to see. When researchers study an ancient hominin, they do not look for one feature alone. A tooth can tell part of a story about diet and relationship. A jaw can suggest patterns of growth and chewing. A skull can show the shape of the brain case, the face, and the muscles that once pulled across bone. Hands and feet can speak about movement, grip, balance, and the daily demands placed on a body. With Homo naledi, these separate clues do not all point with equal force in one familiar direction. The skull is not large by the standards of later humans. The teeth, in some respects, are not simply oversized relics of a distant ape-like past. The foot suggests a creature that spent much of its movement upright. The fingers, with their strong curve, keep attention on climbing or grasping. The result is not a monster, not a missing link in the old careless sense, and not a creature outside nature. It is a real anatomical combination, and the combination matters because it shows that human evolution allowed more than one way of being a member of the human family. The beginning of our own kind becomes easier to misunderstand when we imagine every trait as marching together under one command. In reality, a population survives through the total working body, not through an ideal plan drawn from the future. A foot does not need to wait for a large brain before becoming useful for walking. A hand does not become simple or complex because a later species wants it to fit a clean diagram. The rib cage, shoulder, pelvis, teeth, and skull each respond to inherited structure and lived pressure. Some traits may change slowly because they still serve a purpose. Others may shift more quickly because a new way of moving, feeding, or reproducing places stronger demands upon them. This is why Homo naledi is so useful for a careful sleep story about origins. It slows the listener down. It asks the mind to stop chasing the single feature that explains everything. There may be no single feature. There may only be a body, complete in its own time, that later humans find difficult because we judge it from the far end of the story. The cave bones also remind us that fossils are not philosophical symbols. They are physical remains, shaped by growth and damage, preserved unevenly, compared carefully with other ancient and modern bodies. A skull fragment cannot speak by itself. It gains meaning beside other skulls. A hand bone becomes clearer when placed beside the hands of other hominins, living apes and modern humans. A foot becomes meaningful through its joints, arches, toes, and the forces it could bear. This comparative work is slow, and it is one reason the best science often sounds less dramatic than popular imagination. To say that Homo naledi has mixed traits is not to say it breaks evolution. It is to say evolution is richer than the simplified version many of us first learned. Deep inside the cave, those bones quietly resist the old habit of ranking ancient humans from low to high. They ask for a wider map. On that map, our own ancestors are not alone on an empty road. They are part of a larger African story in which different populations carry different balances of old and new features. Some balances lasted, some vanished. Some left only enough evidence to make us pause. And in that pause, the shape of humanity becomes less like a trophy at the end of time and more like a family of experiments, all real, all vulnerable, all subject to disappearance, leaving us with bones that still ask what progress really means. The most important lesson from a mosaic body is not that it looks strange, but that it asks for a different kind of patience. A modern person may look at Homo naledi and want to separate the bones into two piles, the human-like parts and the older-looking parts. But a living body never existed as two piles. It moved as one body. It balanced on real ground. It climbed or reached with the limbs it had. It chewed with the teeth it grew. It breathed through a chest shaped by inheritance. It carried young bodies, old bodies, injured bodies, and growing bodies through a real environment. When we remember this, the fossils become less like a puzzle made to surprise us, and more like evidence of another way a human relative could be put together. That matters for the beginning of humanity because our own species is often treated as if every important trait had to gather in one direction before the story could become meaningful. Homo naledi quietly says that meaning can exist before neatness. The old features were not failures, simply because they were old. The familiar features were not promises that the body was moving toward us. They were parts of a population that had its own history, separate from the story we prefer to tell from the present. This is one of the calm but powerful corrections that fossils can make. They take away the privilege of hindsight. From the present, it is easy to imagine that evolution always knew where it was going. But natural selection does not look ahead. It does not design a creature for a label. It works with variation in a population, with survival and reproduction in particular places, under particular limits. A trait can remain because it is not harmful enough to disappear. A trait can spread because it helps in one setting and not another. A body can carry a mixture that seems contradictory only because we are comparing it to an endpoint it never tried to reach. In that sense, Homo naledi does not defy evolution. It defies a simplified story about evolution, and that difference is important. The cave discovery does not tell us that all earlier ideas were worthless. It tells us that the human family was broader, more uneven, and perhaps more surprising than the straight lines drawn in the mind. When this body is placed beside the dark chamber where many remains were found, the question becomes more grounded. We are not dealing with a fantasy species invented to challenge belief. We are dealing with fossils, measured bones, comparisons, geological context, and cautious disagreement among researchers. The uncertainty is part of the honesty. Some details are fairly clear. The body was small compared with many modern humans, the brain case was small, the feet and hands show a mixture of traits, and the remains belong to more than one individual. Other details are still debated: how the bones reach the chamber, what behaviours might or might not be implied, and how far we can safely go when interpreting a place that preserves bones but not thoughts. This boundary protects the story from becoming false. It also makes the story deeper. Because the real wonder is not that we have an answer to everything. The real wonder is that one cave can make us see the missing spaces around our knowledge. The beginning of humans was never a clean page turning into another clean page. It was a long record of bodies, some close to ours, some far from ours, some known from fragments, some lost completely. Homo naledi stands among them as a reminder that human identity was not born all at once. It emerged through many forms, many experiments, many endings. And from a narrow chamber beneath the ground, one small-brained, mixed-bodied relative asks us to look at ourselves with less certainty and care. The small brain of Homo naledi is one of the reasons the discovery feels so difficult to place. In many simple accounts of human evolution, the brain grows larger as the story moves closer to us, and that growth is treated almost like the main thread of becoming human. A bigger brain is linked, in the popular imagination, with better tools, deeper planning, clearer memory, stronger cooperation, and eventually the appearance of modern people. There is some truth behind the importance of brain expansion in human evolution, but truth becomes misleading when it is made too simple. The brain did change in important ways across the human family, yet Homo naledi reminds us that brain size alone cannot carry the whole meaning of humanity. Its brain case was small when compared with modern humans and with several other members of Homo, but the rest of the body does not allow us to dismiss it as something outside the human story. The feet, hands, teeth, skull, and placement in the wider family all make the question more careful. What should we do with a species that belongs near us in classification, yet does not follow the expected rule that later human relatives must have large brains? The answer must begin by slowing down. A fossil skull does not preserve thoughts. It does not preserve language, memory, fear, affection, or intention. It gives shape, volume, muscle attachments, and relationships to other bones. From these, researchers can make comparisons, but they cannot simply read a mind. This matters because the title asks whether a cave species defies what we know about humans. It would be easy to answer too quickly and say yes, because a small-brained Homo seems to overturn the old story. But a more honest answer is that it defies a narrow version of the story. It shows that being part of the human family was not controlled by one measurement. A brain is not just a container of size. It is an organ with structure, organization, development, blood supply, and connection to a living body. For fossils, much of that living detail is gone. Scientists can study the inner surface of the skull in some cases, looking for impressions and overall form, but they cannot recover the full working brain. This means caution is not optional. It is part of the evidence. The beginning of humanity must be understood through many signals at once: walking, hands, teeth, growth, social traces, tools when present, and the environments in which bodies lived and died. Homo naledi enters that larger picture as a warning against using one number as a doorway that opens or closes human status. A small brain does not prove simple behavior. A large brain does not prove wisdom. Modern humans know this in a quiet way, because even among ourselves, intelligence, memory, skill, and judgment cannot be measured by skull size. Across species, the problem becomes even more delicate. Different brains can be organized differently. Different bodies can solve survival in different ways. A creature does not need to resemble us in every measure to have been successful in its own world for many generations. Deep in the cave, the small skulls do not tell us a complete life. They create a boundary around what we may say. We may say that the old ladder of progress is too narrow. We may say that brain enlargement was important, but not the only line in the story. We may say that Homo naledi forces us to look again at the relationship between body, brain, and belonging. What we should not say is that the bones reveal a hidden mind exactly like ours, or a mind entirely unlike ours. The cave keeps that answer out of reach, and that restraint is what makes the question stronger. It leaves us with a colder lesson. The origin of humans was shaped not by one rising number, but by many living balances. The small brain question becomes more interesting when it is removed from the habit of ranking. Ranking is easy. It places one species below another, one skull behind another, one number beneath another, until the past looks like a staircase built for us. But evolution does not ask which creature looks more impressive to a later observer. It asks whether a body, a brain, and a way of living could continue long enough to leave descendants, or at least leave traces. Homo naledi stands quietly inside that older rule. Its brain was not large by the measure of modern humans, yet the fossils belong to a creature whose body cannot be dismissed as simply outside the human line. This creates a problem for the old habit of using brain size as the main symbol of becoming human. A small brain case does not erase the rest of the anatomy. It does not erase upright walking. It does not erase hands, teeth, shoulders, feet, and the repeated presence of many individuals in one difficult cave system. Each clue has to remain in the room with the others. None can be allowed to rule alone. The beginning of humanity was not a contest won by a single trait. It was a long, uneven history of bodies meeting environments. In some settings, a larger brain may have carried strong advantages, especially where memory, planning, learning, social coordination, and flexible behavior mattered. But a larger brain is also costly. It requires energy. It shapes birth and childhood. It changes the demands placed on mothers, infants, and groups. For our own species, brain expansion became part of a much wider biological and cultural pattern. But that does not mean every human relative had to follow the same path in the same way. Homo naledi makes that point gently but firmly. It suggests that a member of the wider human family could persist with a brain far smaller than ours, while still carrying other traits that belong in the discussion of Homo. This does not make it more advanced than expected, and it does not make it less meaningful than expected. It makes it different from the expectation itself. The cave helps hold the question in place." End quote. If the fossils had been only a single skull, the mind might focus on cranial capacity and move on, but Rising Star gave a wider body of evidence. The small brain appears with many other bones, and those bones pull the question away from one measurement. The hands invite questions about grasping and manipulation, but not careless certainty about tools. The feet invite questions about walking, but not a complete map of daily life. The teeth and jaws invite comparison, but not a full menu of ancient meals. The chamber invites questions about how remains accumulated, but not a guaranteed story of intention. In the same way, the skull invites questions about cognition, but not a direct view into thought. This balance is central to honest history. To respect the fossil record is to let it speak in its own limited language. The cold truth is that we do not need to know exactly what Homo naledi thought in order to understand why it matters. Its importance lies partly in what it removes from our assumptions. It removes the idea that brain size alone can define the human family. It removes the comfort of a single rising line. It removes the belief that every later surviving form must resemble us more closely than earlier forms did. When we look back toward the origins of humans, this matters because our own identity has often been tied to the brain, as if the brain floated above the body. But no brain ever lived alone. It was fed by a body carried by legs, protected by a skull, shaped through development, and tested by a world of hunger, distance, danger, childhood, and death. Homo naledi brings the brain back into that whole living arrangement. The small skulls from the cave do not make the past smaller, they make the map larger. They allow room for a human relative that was not on the direct road to us, not a simple failure beside us, and not a dramatic answer to every mystery. It was one more form in a once crowded human landscape, reminding us that the mind of our species came from deep roots, but those roots divided in ways we are still learning to see. The small brain of Homo naledi becomes most powerful when it is allowed to remain unresolved. It does not need to be turned into a secret intelligence, and it does not need to be reduced to a sign of simplicity. Both reactions move too quickly. One tries to make the species more like us than the evidence can support. The other pushes it too far away, as if a small skull settles every question before the rest of the body is heard. A better path is slower. The brain case tells us that this hominin did not follow the same pattern of large-brained humanity seen in later members of our line. The feet, hands, teeth, and bones from the cave tell us that the creature still belongs inside the broader human story. Between those two facts, there is a quiet pressure on our thinking. We are asked to separate the evidence from the habit of pride. Modern humans often identify themselves with thought, speech, memory, planning, and imagination. Those abilities matter, but they can make us forget that humanity also began as anatomy, birth, walking, hunger, pain, childhood, and survival. A brain is part of that whole, not a crown floating above it. Homo naledi brings the question back down into the body, where the story of human origins first took shape. If we look across the wider human family, the picture is not a smooth rise from small minds to large minds. It is a branching history in which different populations carried different bodies through different worlds. Some branches show larger brains. Some show powerful jaws, long arms, changing hands, or feet adapted for ground movement. Some are known from so little that silence surrounds them. Homo naledi is unusual because it gives enough material to see a repeated body plan, while still refusing to fit the neat sequence people expect. That refusal is not loud, it is gentle. It asks us to stop treating the present as the measure of past life. The fact that only one human species survives now can make the past look emptier than it was. But the fossil record keeps reminding us that other human relatives lived, reproduced, and disappeared without becoming us. Their value is not measured by whether they led directly to modern people. They show the range of forms that evolution once allowed near the roots of our own existence. In this light, the small brain problem becomes a lesson in humility. We can say that brain expansion was central to the later history of Homo sapiens. We can say that the human mind, in our species, became tied to language, kaphancha, tools, teaching, and memory in ways that transformed the planet. but we cannot take that later outcome and project it backward as a rule that every human relative must obey. Homo naledi stands as evidence against that easy projection. It suggests that a small-brained hominin could still be part of the human family, still have a body shaped for movement, and still leave behind a pattern that makes the cave difficult to explain. The cave does not tell us what it knew. It does not tell us what it felt. It does not tell us whether it understood darkness, death, or one another in any way we would recognize. Those questions remain beyond the bones for now. What the cave does tell us is more restrained and perhaps more important. The story of human origins was never controlled by one measurement. Not brain size alone, not walking alone, not tools alone, not any single sign taken in isolation. To understand where we came from, we have to hold many traces together without forcing them into a conclusion before they are ready. Deep inside that chamber, the skulls of Homo naledi do not end the search for what makes us human. They make the question wider, quieter, and more honest. The feet of Homo naledi bring the story down from the skull and into the ground. A brain can tempt us to think in symbols, but feet remind us that every human origin began with weight, balance, distance, and contact with the earth. Before there were theories, before there were names, before any fossil was placed in a drawer, there were bodies moving through landscapes. The foot is one of the places where that movement becomes visible after death. In Homo naledi, the foot has often drawn attention because important parts of it appear well suited to upright walking. That does not mean the creature walked exactly as we do, or lived the same way, or carried the same daily habits. Fossils rarely permit that kind of certainty. But the foot does suggest that this species was not merely a shadow of older tree-adapted forms. It belonged to a long experiment in standing, stepping, balancing, and moving across land on two legs. This matters because bipedal movement is one of the deep roots of the human line. Long before large modern brains, long before cities, writing, farming, or even our own species, ancient hominins were already shaped by the strange commitment of carrying the body upright through the world. The foot of Homo naledi places it inside that older inheritance, even while other parts of the body complicate the picture. The hands tell a different but related story. They are not simply modern hands placed on an ancient body. The fingers show a strong curve, a feature often connected with grasping and climbing in the broader comparison of primate anatomy. At the same time, the hand also carries traits that raise questions about manipulation. This mixture is not a contradiction in the life of the animal. It is only a contradiction to a simple expectation. A hand can be useful in more than one way. A body can walk on the ground and still climb. A species can rely on upright movement without losing every older capacity at once. The beginning of humans did not require the immediate abandonment of the past. It often worked by layering one capacity over another, producing bodies that could move through more than one kind of space. For Homo naledi, the combination of feet and hands invites a picture of movement that stays cautious, a ground-moving hominin that may also have retained meaningful ability in climbing or grasping. Anything beyond that must be said gently, because the bones do not give us a daily schedule. The cave makes these limbs feel especially important. Rising Star was not an open field where movement could be imagined only across flat land. It was a system of stone, narrow openings, passages, drops, and darkness. To think about a body there is to think about shoulders turning, feet finding holds, fingers touching rock, and joints working under pressure. This does not prove that Homo naledi regularly explored caves, or that the species had a cave-centered life. The fossil chamber alone cannot tell us that. But it does make anatomy harder to separate from place. A body with human-like feet and curved fingers, found deep inside such a difficult system, asks questions about access that are physical before they are symbolic. How could remains enter? What bodies could pass? What movements were possible? These are not dramatic questions. They are slow questions of bone and stone. They bring us closer to the origin of humans because they return the story to the ordinary facts that made all later humanity possible. Hands that touched, feet that carried, bodies that learned the limits of their surroundings. Modern people often think of humanity as thought first and body second. Homo naledi reverses that comfort. It reminds us that the human family was built through movement long before it was understood through ideas. Beneath the surface, in a cave that narrows the body and removes the light, hands and feet become more than anatomical details. They become traces of a way of being human adjacent that was not ours, yet still belonged to the same wide and unfinished story. The body becomes easier to understand when it is imagined under pressure, not in a museum case. A foot on level ground tells one story, but a foot placed against stone, loose soil, or an uneven slope tells another. A hand resting open on a table tells little, but a hand closing around a narrow edge, a branch, or a rough surface begins to reveal why shape matters. Homo naledi is important because its limbs seem to carry this kind of layered possibility. The foot suggests a creature deeply committed to moving upright. The toes, ankle, and general structure point toward a body that could carry weight on two legs in a way that belongs within the wider human pattern. Yet the upper body keeps older questions alive. Curved fingers, shoulder form, and other details do not let us imagine a fully modern body simply walking through an ancient landscape like a smaller version of ourselves. The evidence asks for a more careful picture. A hominin whose life may have required both ground movement and a body still capable of using the vertical world when needed. That possibility matters for the origin of humans because our beginning was not only a story of standing up, it was also a story of what had to be retained while standing became important. The old image of human evolution sometimes shows a creature coming down from the trees and then leaving that world behind forever. But real evolution rarely makes such clean exits. A population may become better at walking without immediately losing every trait useful for climbing, reaching, or stabilizing the body in difficult places. In changing African environments, the ability to move across ground would have mattered, but landscapes were not smooth floors. They included slopes, rocks, vegetation, broken ground, shelters, and places where the body had to adjust constantly. A mixed anatomy could make sense in such a world, even if it feels untidy when compared with modern humans. The cave gives this point a stronger shape. Rising Star is not merely the place where bones were stored by time, it is a physical test for any explanation. Narrow passages remind us that bodies have width. Vertical spaces remind us that limbs have reach. Darkness reminds us that movement is not only mechanical, it depends on caution, contact, and orientation. We do not need to imagine scenes we cannot prove. We do not need to say that Homo naledi habitually entered caves, or that it understood the cave as modern humans might. The evidence does not permit that certainty. But the fossil location makes anatomy impossible to treat as decoration. The hands and feet become part of the same question as the chamber. What kinds of movement could bring a body, or remains of a body, into such a place? What kinds of limbs could pass through constricted stone? What limits would the cave impose on any explanation involving accident, animals, water, or repeated entry? These questions are careful because they begin with surfaces, joints, and space, not imagination. They also return us to a quieter truth about humanity. Before the human family became a story of tools and symbols, it was a story of bodies negotiating the world. The first human relatives did not begin with ideas about themselves. They began with balance, grip, endurance, fear of falling, and the need to move from one place to another. Homo naledi stands inside that older inheritance. Its feet bring it close to the ground path of the human line. Its hands and upper body keep the memory of other movement alive. Together they show that evolution did not erase the past in one gesture. It carried the past forward, remembered it, and sometimes left behind a body that seems to belong to several moments at once. That is why the limbs matter so deeply in this cave. Hands and feet are humble evidence, but they are among the most honest traces in the fossil record. They do not tell us what a species believed, and they do not let us hear a voice from the past. They tell us where weight could fall, where force could pass, where fingers could close, where toes could press, and how a body might meet the world before any thought becomes visible. Homo naledi matters here because its limbs do not allow one easy image. The foot draws the mind toward upright walking, toward the long human experiment of carrying the body over distance with the hands freed from constant support. The hand draws the mind toward grasping, climbing, touching, and perhaps careful manipulation, though the evidence must not be stretched beyond what bone can show. Between them is a body that seems to stand at a crossing point, not because it was halfway to us, but because it preserves a mixture that modern expectation finds hard to simplify. This is one reason the cave discovery reaches so deeply into the question of human origins. It reminds us that our beginning was not an idea first. It was a posture, a balance, a set of joints, a way of moving through land, trees, stone, slope and shadow. The modern human body hides this history because it feels normal to us. We stand, walk, reach and hold without thinking of the long inheritance inside these motions. But in an ancient relative, the same body regions become strange again. A foot that seems close to ours asks how old the ground path truly is. A curved finger asks what older forms of movement remained useful. A shoulder that does not fit the modern pattern asks whether the body kept capacities that our own lineage later reduced or reshaped. These details are not small, they belong to the deep architecture of life. Every later human achievement, even the most abstract, depended on a body that could move, carry, gather, protect, and endure. Before memory could be passed by words, bodies had to survive long enough for generations to continue. The cave makes that survival feel physical. It narrows the question until it becomes almost tactile. A body is not just classified, it must fit through space. A limb is not just described, it must bend under limits. A hand is not just compared, it must make contact with a surface. In Rising Star, this matters because the fossils were found in a place where movement is inseparable from explanation. We cannot say with certainty how the remains arrived there. We cannot turn anatomy into a full story of intention, but we can see why the limbs matter. Any serious explanation must respect the size of passages, the difficulty of access, and the kind of body represented by the bones. The cave refuses to let the species remain only a skull with a small brain. It asks us to consider the whole organism, feet beneath it, hands before it, shoulders around it, breath inside it, and stone surrounding it. That whole organism is what evolution shaped. When we return to the title question, the defiance is quieter than it first appears. Homo naledi does not defy biology. It defies our wish for a clean human outline. It shows that a human relative could carry upright walking and older climbing signals together, could belong near us without resembling us completely, and could leave its remains in a place that makes movement itself part of the mystery. The lesson is not that we now know exactly how this species lived. The lesson is that the human family once contained bodies with combinations we might not have imagined, bodies that move through worlds now gone, leaving behind only enough evidence to slow our certainty and deepen the question. The question of why so many bones were found deep inside the cave is where the discovery becomes most delicate. Until now, the body of Homo naledi has already asked us to slow down. The feet, hands, skull and limbs have shown that a human relative can carry a mixture of traits without fitting a straight line. But the cave adds another layer, because bones are never only bones. They have a position, they have a setting, they have a relationship to rock, sediment, water, entrances, passages, and time. In the Rising Star system, the remains were not represented by one isolated individual. They belonged to many individuals, including different ages, gathered in a chamber, reached through difficult passages. That fact is not an answer. It is the beginning of a harder question. How did so many bodies, or parts of bodies, come to rest in a place so far from ordinary daylight? For any fossil site, scientists first have to examine natural explanations. Water can move bones, but moving water often leaves signs in sediment, sorting, abrasion, or the pattern of where bones collect. Predators can drag bodies into caves, but they often leave marks from teeth, breakage, or a pattern that reflects feeding. Accidents can place a body in a dangerous space, but many individuals in the same deep area raise a different level of difficulty. The cave may have changed over time, and ancient openings may not always match the openings known today. That possibility must be considered carefully, because caves are not frozen structures. They can collapse, seal, erode, and shift across long periods. Each explanation has to pass through geology before it becomes plausible. It must fit the stone, the passages, the sediments, and the bones themselves. This is why the Homo naledi remains cannot honestly be turned into one simple story. The location is unusual, but unusual does not automatically mean intentional. A deep chamber can preserve mystery without proving meaning. The beginning of the human story has many places where absence tempts imagination. A bone without a tool beside it leaves one kind of silence. A skull without a full skeleton leaves another. A chamber with many remains leaves perhaps the strongest silence of all, because it looks organized enough to invite interpretation, yet limited enough to resist certainty. Some researchers have explored the idea that the bodies may have entered the chamber through repeated activity by Homo naledi itself. Others have emphasized the need for caution, asking whether natural processes, ancient cave conditions, or incomplete evidence could still explain some part of the pattern. A sleep story rooted in science must allow that disagreement to remain visible. It must not flatten uncertainty into drama. What we can say is that the accumulation is difficult, important, and central to why the species changed the conversation. The chamber makes Homo naledi more than an anatomical puzzle. It connects the body to behavior, but only at the edge of what can be responsibly said. If a species with a small brain and mixed body traits was involved in moving bodies into a deep place, that would matter greatly. But the word "if" must remain in the sentence. Without that small word, the story becomes stronger than the evidence. With it, the story becomes more honest and more powerful. Deep in the cave, the bones do not declare their own path. They ask us to test each possibility slowly. Water, predators, accident, geology, repeated entry, and other processes that may not fit neatly into modern expectation. The origin of humans was shaped not only by what our relatives could do, but also by what the Earth happened to preserve. In Rising Star, preservation has given us a chamber filled with questions, and the first duty is not to solve them too quickly. Every possible explanation for the rising star bones has to move through the cave before it can move through the mind. This is easy to forget, because human beings naturally search for intention. When many bodies are found in one hidden place, we begin to wonder whether someone chose that place. But science must begin earlier than that. It must ask what the rocks allow, what the sediments show, what the bones have suffered, and what the shape of the chamber makes likely or unlikely. A cave is not a passive container. It has passages that open and close, floors that collect material, cracks that admit water, and surfaces that can change over long spans of time. If remains entered through water, the cave should preserve some signs of movement. If large animals carried them in, the bones might show a pattern of damage or feeding. If bodies fell through an opening that no longer exists, geology must make room for that lost entrance. If the accumulation happened through repeated entry by Homo naledi, then the cave becomes part of a question about behavior. Each path is serious only if it survives contact with the physical evidence. That is why this discovery is so demanding. It does not let us choose the most interesting story simply because it feels meaningful. The beginning of humanity is full of such traps. A modern mind knows graves, mourning, memory, and care for the dead, so it is tempted to see those things whenever bones appear in unusual places. But the past must not be forced to look like us. To call something deliberate, the evidence has to be stronger than the desire to believe it. At the same time, caution should not become refusal. If a pattern is genuinely difficult for natural processes to explain, that difficulty should also be respected. Honest interpretation lives between these two errors. It does not rush toward ritual, and it does not dismiss every possibility of behavior before the evidence is weighed. With Homo naledi, the chamber keeps that balance tense. The remains are numerous. They appear to represent different individuals. They were found in a hard-to-reach area. These facts matter. Yet facts are not the same as a finished explanation. They are the walls within which an explanation must stand. This is why the cave changes the emotional rhythm of the story. On the surface, we might ask what Homo naledi looked like. Underground, we ask what happened after life ended. That shift is profound, because death is one of the places where human identity feels most sensitive. For our own species, the dead can become part of memory, family, place, and meaning. But we cannot hand those meanings backward into another species without proof. We can only ask whether the pattern of bones permits, requires, or resists such ideas. The careful answer remains open. Some interpretations suggest that the bodies may have been placed or carried into the chamber by members of the species. Other interpretations urge more restraint, pointing to the complexity of cave formation, preservation, and incomplete evidence. For a listener thinking about human origins at night, this uncertainty is not a failure, it is the shape of real knowledge. The cave teaches that some of the most important discoveries do not hand us certainty. They teach us how to ask better questions. Homo naledi does not need a final dramatic explanation in order to matter. The number of remains, the difficult location, and the unusual anatomy already make it a doorway into a larger problem. How much of the human story can be read from bones, and how much must remain in darkness until stronger evidence appears? That darkness is not empty, it is the honest space between what the cave has preserved, what the bones can show, and what our careful minds must leave unclaimed for now in silence tonight quietly. The deeper question in Rising Star is not only how the bones arrived, but why the answer matters so much to the human story. A pile of ancient bones can be treated as a technical problem. Where did they come from? What moved them? What damaged them? What preserved them? Yet when the bones belong to a human relative, the problem becomes more intimate. We begin to ask whether the living noticed the dead, whether bodies were left by accident, whether nature gathered them without intention, or whether some behavior occurred that sits near the edge of what we once thought only larger-brained humans could do. This is the point where care becomes essential. A cave chamber is not a thought. It cannot tell us why. It can only give us position, condition, geology, and pattern. From those, researchers build explanations, then test them against everything the site allows. If an explanation demands too much, it weakens. If it ignores the difficulty of the place, it also weakens. The safest path is not the simplest path. It is the one that keeps every serious possibility visible until the evidence narrows the field. Homo naledi stands in that careful space. The remains were found in a setting that does not feel ordinary for a natural death assemblage, yet feeling is not evidence by itself. The chamber is difficult to reach, yet caves can change. The bones are numerous, yet numbers alone do not prove intention. The absence of clear predator damage may matter, yet absence must be handled cautiously. The possibility of repeated entry may be important, yet it must not become a finished story without enough support. This is why the cave has become such a powerful symbol in the study of human origins. It shows how easily the mind moves from bone to meaning, and how slowly science must move back from meaning to bone. In the early human family, behavior is often the hardest thing to recover. A femur can preserve its shape, a tooth can preserve its enamel, a skull can preserve the outline of a brain case. But an intention disappears at the moment of action unless it leaves a trace strong enough to survive. For modern humans, the dead are surrounded by customs, grief, memory, and place. For Homo naledi, we do not have permission to place those human meanings directly into the cave. What we have is more limited and therefore more valuable. A pattern that is difficult, a body that is unusual, and a site that makes simple explanations uneasy. This gives the discovery its quiet force. It does not say with certainty that a small-brained human relative treated the dead in a way we would recognize. It does not say, with certainty, that water, accident, or geology solved everything. It leaves us in the middle, where the most honest questions live. That middle ground is not weak. It is where knowledge grows without becoming fiction. As the story moves outward from the chamber, Homo naledi begins to change the way we think about the whole human past. If the remains entered naturally, the cave still reveals a remarkable preservation of a strange branch of Homo. If the remains entered through repeated behavior, the implications become even deeper. But that possibility must remain carefully worded. Either way, the discovery reminds us that our beginning was not only made of tools, fire, and large brains. It was also made of bodies, places, deaths, accidents, traces, and uncertainties. Deep inside the cave, the bones do not close the mystery. They make it more disciplined. They teach us that the most useful question is not always what happened, but what the evidence truly allows us to say. The most dangerous moment in a discovery is not always the moment when too little is known. Sometimes it is the moment when enough is known to tempt the imagination, but not enough is known to protect every conclusion. Homo naledi stands exactly in that delicate place. The cave is deep, the bones are numerous, the body is unusual, The brain is small. The human connection is real but not simple. From these facts, the mind naturally wants a larger story. It wants to know whether this species carried its dead, whether it used fire and darkness, whether marks on stone can be connected to its hands, whether a small-brained relative had behaviors once thought to belong only to larger-brained humans. These are serious questions, and some of them are being discussed in scientific debate. But a serious question is not the same as a settled answer. For a story about human origins to remain trustworthy, it must respect the difference between what is observed, what is inferred, and what is still uncertain. That difference may feel quiet, but it is the line that keeps wonder from becoming fiction. In the study of ancient humans, evidence often arrives in layers. A bone is one layer, its position in sediment is another, damage on its surface is another, the shape of the cave is another, the age estimate is another. Nearby stone, charcoal, marks, tools, or animal remains can add further layers, but each must be connected carefully. A claim about burial is not built from a feeling that a place looks meaningful. It requires a pattern that is difficult to explain by natural processes and consistent with deliberate placement. A claim about fire is not built from darkness alone. It requires physical traces that can be tested, such as burned material, heat alteration, or clear context. A claim about engraving or symbolic behavior cannot rest only on lines that look interesting to modern eyes. It has to ask whether the marks are human-made, how old they are, whether they are associated with the species in question, and whether other natural causes can be ruled out. These standards are not designed to make the past dull. They are designed to keep it real. The origin of humans is too important to be protected by excitement alone. Homo naledi shows why this matters. If we rush toward dramatic interpretations, we may make the species seem more familiar than the evidence allows. If we refuse every possibility before testing it, we may make the past smaller than it was. Both errors come from the same impatience. The first fills darkness with our own image. The second closes the darkness before looking carefully. A better approach moves slowly between them. It lets the cave remain strange. It lets the body remain mixed. It lets the small brain remain challenging. It allows debate without turning debate into certainty. In that way, the discovery becomes more powerful, not less. The listener does not need a forced miracle to feel the depth of the cave. The real facts are already enough to unsettle the old story. A human relative with a small brain, a mosaic body, and many remains in a difficult underground space. The careful mind can sit with that without demanding an immediate ending. This kind of restraint is one of the quiet virtues of science. It teaches that not knowing is not the same as knowing nothing. It means the question is still alive, waiting for stronger evidence, better methods, and more patient comparison. Deep inside Rising Star, the bones do not ask us to believe every extraordinary claim. They ask us to listen closely enough that the past is not drowned out by our desire for certainty. A careful claim about an ancient species must carry its own weight. It cannot lean only on surprise. This is especially true with Homo naledi, because the discovery touches some of the most sensitive questions in human evolution. When people hear about bones deep in a cave, they may think of death rituals. When they hear about darkness, they may think of fire. When they hear about lines on stone, they may think of symbols. These ideas are not foolish in themselves. They are part of the reason the site has drawn attention. But each idea must be separated from the others and tested on its own. A deep cave does not automatically prove fire. Many bones do not automatically prove burial. A small-brained species does not automatically prove either simplicity or complexity. The evidence must be asked one question at a time, and every answer must remain tied to something that can be examined. This slow method protects the story from becoming a reflection of modern hopes. It also protects the dignity of the ancient species itself, because it allows Homo naledi to be understood through its own traces, not through the roles we want it to play in our imagination. The origin of humans has often been told as a story of special thresholds. At one moment a species walks upright. At another, it makes tools. At another, it uses fire. At another, it thinks symbolically. These thresholds can be useful for teaching, but they can also create a false sense that human evolution moved through locked doors in a fixed order. Homo naledi makes those doors harder to draw. If a small-brained relative appears in a context that raises questions about repeated movement into a cave, then the older Rosada becomes less comfortable. Yet, discomfort is not proof. It is only the beginning of investigation. A claim becomes stronger when it survives the effort to disprove it. That is why scientists look for alternative explanations first. Could marks on rock have been made by natural processes, later visitors, or unrelated activity? Could traces that seem connected belong to another time? Could bones have moved after death in ways that are not obvious at first glance? Could cave passages have changed enough to alter our view of difficulty? These questions may sound cautious, but they are not meant to erase wonder. They are the path through which wonder becomes knowledge. There is also a deeper lesson here about how we define humanity. Modern humans often build identity around the features we value most: thought, language, memory, art, planning, and care for the dead. Because these things matter so much to us, we may search for their earliest signs with great hunger. But hunger can blur the edge of evidence. If we see every unusual line as symbol, every dark passage as ritual, and every collection of bones as burial, then the past becomes too much like a mirror. Homo naledi deserves a more careful reading. It may have done things that challenge our expectations. It may also have left a pattern that looks meaningful because natural history is sometimes strange. Both possibilities must be allowed to breathe. This is not indecision. It is honesty in the presence of incomplete traces. Deep time rarely gives complete scenes. It gives fragments, and those fragments must be arranged with humility. The cave, the bones, the body, and the debates around them all return us to the same quiet discipline. Do not make the evidence smaller than it is, and do not make it larger than it can bear. In that balance, Homo naledi becomes more than a headline. It becomes a lesson in how the human story should be told, not as a chain of dramatic claims, but as a careful listening to stone, bone, silence, and time. The species may not answer every question about what makes us human, but it teaches us how easily the answer can be distorted when certainty arrives too soon. The boundary between evidence and imagination is not a wall against wonder. It is the shape that lets wonder survive. Without that boundary, Homo naledi would quickly become whatever a storyteller wanted it to be: a hidden people of the dark, a species with secret rituals, a lost mind equal to ours, or a creature too simple to deserve careful thought. None of those images is responsible. The fossils ask for something slower. They ask us to look at the chamber, the bones, the body, and the debates without forcing them into a single dramatic meaning. A truthful account must be willing to say that some claims are possible but not settled, interesting but still under examination, meaningful but not yet proven. This does not weaken the discovery. It makes it stronger, because it allows the real strangeness to remain attached to the real evidence. Homo naledi does not need borrowed certainty to matter. Its small brain, mixed body, and difficult cave context already place it near the center of a serious question about the human family. The beginning of humans has often been shaped by stories that are too neat. We remember the increase of brain size. We remember the use of tools. We remember fire, language, art, and burial as if each were a step on a staircase. But the fossil record is not a staircase. It is broken ground. Some pieces are clear, some are missing, some appear in unexpected places. Some seem to point in one direction until another discovery changes the angle of the light. Homo naledi belongs to this more difficult landscape. It reminds us that traits do not always gather in the order we expect, and that behavior is harder to recover than bone. A skeleton can preserve the curve of a finger. It cannot preserve the intention behind a touch. A cave can preserve the position of remains. It cannot, by itself, preserve the meaning of their arrival. A line on stone can invite interpretation. It cannot become a symbol unless the evidence around it can carry that claim. This is where the story becomes deeply human, not because we know what Homo naledi thought, but because we recognize the limits of our own knowing. Modern humans are meaning-making creatures. We connect fragments, we search for patterns, we dislike silence. That gift built science, memory, and history. But it can also lead us too far when the past is incomplete. The careful study of Homo naledi asks us to use that gift with restraint. We can imagine possibilities, but we must label them as possibilities. We can respect debate, but we must not turn debate into proof. We can feel the emotional pull of a dark chamber filled with ancient bones, but we must still return to geology, anatomy, dating, comparison, and context. This slow return is what keeps the story useful for the listener. It teaches a wider lesson about origins. To understand where we came from, we must accept that our past is not only a record of triumphs, it is also a record of uncertainties, losses, side branches, and unfinished questions. Some forms of humanity may have lived near our wider story without becoming us. Some may have held capacities we do not yet understand. Some may have left traces that will never tell us everything. Homo naledi stands among these traces like a quiet warning against arrogance. Deep inside the cave, the bones do not ask to be made more mysterious than they are. They ask to be taken seriously enough that we do not cover them with false certainty. In that seriousness, the discovery keeps its power, not as proof that everything we knew was wrong, but as evidence that what we know about humans is still incomplete. Time changes the meaning of a fossil. A bone that is very old may be difficult to understand, but it can still fit comfortably into the idea that early human relatives were unlike us because they belonged to a remote beginning. A bone that is much later can disturb the story more deeply because it places difference closer to the world of familiar humanity. Homo naledi became more challenging when dating work suggested that it lived surprisingly late in the history of the human family, at a time when Africa was already holding populations much closer to our own species. That does not mean we should imagine a crowded scene with every ancient human standing face to face. The geography was wide, the evidence incomplete, and the timing of different populations is not always simple, but the general implication is important. A small-brained, mosaic-bodied member of Homo may have existed much nearer to the age of early Homo sapiens than many people would have expected. This does not turn Homo naledi into our ancestor. It does not make it a rival kingdom in the shadows. It simply widens the human landscape. The beginning of our own species did not unfold in an empty Africa waiting for one final form to appear. It unfolded in a continent of varied environments, separated regions, changing climates, and populations whose remains are only partly known. In that wider world, a species like Homo naledi reminds us that evolutionary time is not always arranged in the tidy order that memory prefers. Older-looking traits can remain late, more familiar traits can appear early. A lineage can continue quietly while another lineage is changing in different ways. The present makes this hard to feel, because now there is only one living human species. From that lonely present, the past can look like a narrowing road, as if all other forms were merely earlier steps that vanished before we arrived. But the fossil record suggests a more crowded and uneven picture. Different human relatives may have overlapped across broad spans of time, sometimes in distant places, sometimes perhaps closer than we can yet prove. This possibility matters because it changes how we understand uniqueness. Homo sapiens may be the only surviving human species, but survival at the end should not be confused with solitude at the beginning. The cave species forces this point gently. It shows that deep variety could persist within the human family even when other branches were becoming more like us in brain size, face shape, tools, or behavior. The late presence of Homo naledi, tis the dating as accepted within current evidence, also makes the cave itself feel less like a relic from a distant dawn, and more like a window into a world that was still experimenting with human forms. The phrase late survival must be handled carefully. It does not prove direct contact with early modern humans. It does not prove competition, speech, exchange, or conflict. Those claims would require different evidence. What it does suggest is enough. Human evolution did not replace older forms instantly, everywhere, in a smooth wave. Some branches may have lasted in particular places while others expanded elsewhere. Some may have been small populations, limited in range, and vulnerable to disappearance. Some may have left no descendants, no tools we can confidently assign, and no genetic trace yet known. Still, their bones matter because they show that the human family was wider than the line leading to us. Deep inside the cave, time becomes another passage, as narrow and difficult as stone. To move through it honestly, We must give up the easy belief that later always means more modern, or that older traits belong only to the deep past. Homo naledi asks us to imagine an Africa where the roots of humanity did not grow as one straight trunk, but as living branches near one another, some strong, some hidden, some already close to silence. Dating does not simply place Homo naledi on a calendar, it changes the surrounding room of thought. When a species with such a small brain and such a mixed body appears in a relatively late window of human evolution, the mind has to make space for overlap, persistence, and uneven change. It becomes harder to imagine the human past as a clean replacement of one form by another. Older-looking bodies did not always vanish the moment newer-looking bodies appeared. A lineage could remain in a region, perhaps in small numbers, while other populations elsewhere were changing in ways that would later seem closer to us. This is not unusual in evolution. Different species often share broad time periods without sharing the same exact places or the same daily worlds. The difficulty comes from our habit of making human evolution feel exceptional, as if it must have followed a simpler order than the rest of life. Homo naledi asks us to let the human family behave like nature, branching, lingering, fragmenting, and disappearing at different speeds. The beginning of Homo sapiens was not a single spark in an empty field. It was a long process within Africa, shaped by geography, climate, population movement, isolation, and connection. Some groups may have been separated for long stretches. Others may have exchanged genes or ideas when contact was possible. Some left fossils that are easier to connect to our own ancestry. Others, like Homo naledi, may represent a side branch whose relationship to us is not direct but still deeply informative. The late dating matters because it places this side branch nearer to the world in which our own species was emerging. It suggests that human variety was not only an ancient memory from the far beginning, it may still have been present while the story leading to modern humans was already underway. That thought quietly weakens the old image of one dominant path becoming clearer with every generation. Time, in this case, does not simplify. It thickens. It adds another layer to the continent where our roots formed. We should be careful, however, not to turn overlap into a scene we cannot prove. To say that Homo naledi lived in a broadly similar era to early Homo sapiens is not the same as saying the two met. Africa is vast. Populations can exist at the same time and remain separated by distance, ecology, or chance. Fossils often give us scattered points, not continuous maps. A date from one cave does not show a conversation, a conflict, or a shared landscape. It shows presence within a range of time. That is already important enough. The evidence does not need extra drama. In fact, its importance depends on restraint. If we imagine too much, we lose sight of the real finding. A small-brained member of Homo persisted late enough to challenge the expectation that later human relatives must look steadily more modern. This does not overturn the role of Homo sapiens. It places our species inside a wider setting. The cave becomes a reminder that our ancestors were not moving through a world emptied of alternatives. Even if they never encountered Homo naledi, they belonged to a continent where different human forms had arisen, adapted, endured, and vanished. That wider setting changes the emotional meaning of our survival. It is not simply that we climbed higher than all others. It is that we are what remains from a deeper and more varied family. Many branches ended without becoming failures in any moral sense. They ended because environments changed, populations were small, resources shifted, or chance moved against them. Homo naledi may have been one of those branches. Its late presence, preserved in darkness, lets us feel the human past not as a straight road behind us, but as a landscape where several roads existed at once, and where most of them eventually became silent. The late placement of Homo naledi changes the feeling of the cave. It no longer seems only like a chamber from the remote dawn of the human family. It begins to feel like a hidden room inside a larger and more complicated world, one in which several human stories may have been unfolding at different speeds. This is difficult for the modern mind because we live after the narrowing has already happened. We know only one human species today, so we are tempted to imagine that the past was always leaning toward this outcome. But the fossil record does not support that comfort. It shows a history of experiments, survivals, separations, and endings. Homo naledi, if understood within its late time range, becomes a quiet reminder that old-looking traits could continue near the age when more familiar human forms were also present somewhere in Africa. Time did not erase variety as quickly as a simple story might suggest. It allowed different branches to remain visible, at least for a while, before most of them disappeared without leaving descendants we can clearly trace. This is where the discovery touches the origin of our own species most directly. Homo sapiens did not appear outside nature, and did not appear outside a population world. Our beginnings were shaped by groups living across African landscapes, sometimes separated, sometimes connected, always affected by climate, distance, food, birth, death, and chance. To place Homo naledi near that broader time does not make it our ancestor. It does not place it in our direct bloodline, but it does change the scenery around our beginning. Instead of a single path becoming steadily brighter, we see a continent holding several forms of humanity, some closer to us, some farther away, some perhaps small in number, some known only through fragments. A cave species with a small brain and a mixed body does not need to stand on our direct road in order to change how that road looks. A side path can still show that the landscape was wider than the road itself. The caution remains important. Dates carry ranges. Fossil sites are separated by space. A broad overlap in time is not proof of contact. It does not give us conversations, competition, shared tools, or recognition between groups. It gives us something quieter but still profound. The possibility that human diversity persisted later than older models allowed many people to imagine. That possibility makes the idea of human uniqueness less lonely and more historical. Modern humans are unique today because we are the only surviving human species, but that uniqueness is the result of a long process, not a condition that existed from the beginning. Other human relatives had their own time under the sun, or in the shade of forests, or near caves and stone. Their disappearance is part of our story, not because they became us, but because their absence shaped the world in which only we remained. This is a gentle kind of loss, not gentle in its reality, but gentle in the way it reaches us through silence. We do not hear the last generation of such a branch. We do not know the final season in which its numbers fell. We only meet the trace afterward, when stone has outlasted flesh and the name comes much later than the life. Rising Star preserves one of those absences in the form of presence. Bones in darkness. A body that should not be simplified. A date that refuses to sit comfortably in the old order. As we leave this question of time, the cave remains behind us, but its lesson follows. Later does not always mean more modern. Older traits do not always belong only to older ages. Survival is not proof of superiority, and disappearance is not proof of failure. The human family was once broader than the living world now shows. Homo naledi stands in that lost breadth, asking us to think of our origin not as a single line advancing through emptiness, but as one surviving thread among many threads that time has quietly cut away. Africa was never a simple background for the human story. It was the living ground of the story itself, wide enough to hold forests, grasslands, rivers, highlands, caves, coastlines, dry basins, and changing corridors of movement. When people speak of human origins, the word Africa can sound like one place, almost like one room where one event happened. But the continent was not one room. It was a shifting world of many regions, each with its own pressures and possibilities. Populations could become separated by distance, climate, water, mountains, deserts, or simply by the slow difficulty of moving across land. Over many generations, separation can give a population its own shape. Connection can bring lineages back into contact. Change can happen unevenly, not because evolution is confused, but because real landscapes are uneven. Homo naledi becomes easier to understand inside this wider African setting. It does not need to be forced onto the direct road to Homo sapiens. It can be seen as one branch among several, a branch that helps show how broad the human family once was. The mistake would be to imagine Africa as a straight corridor leading from an ancient ape-like ancestor to modern humans. The fossil record has never been that clean. Different hominins lived in different places at different times, and our knowledge of them depends on what stone, sediment, and chance allowed to survive. Some places preserve fossils well, others erase them almost completely. Some populations may have lived for long periods and left only a few bones, while others may have vanished without leaving anything we have found. This means the story of human origins is partly a story of absence. What we know is real, but it is not complete. Homo naledi reminds us of that incompleteness with unusual force, because it appeared where many expected fewer surprises, within the genus Homo, within a relatively late time frame, and with a body that did not match a neat sequence of progress. It widens the map not by becoming the center, but by proving the center was never alone. The roots of our own species grew in this wider condition. Early Homo sapiens did not rise from a single clean line isolated from all other forms of humanity. Our ancestry likely involved populations spread across parts of Africa, with periods of separation and connection over time. That larger process makes more sense if we stop imagining a single birthplace as a tiny dot and begin imagining a continent of related populations changing under different pressures. In that world, a side branch like Homo naledi becomes deeply informative. It shows that human relatives could persist with their own combinations of traits, while other populations moved along different paths. It shows that being close to the human story does not mean being on the same road. It shows that the category human has always been more complicated than the living present suggests. Today, the word human usually means us. In deep history, it points toward a broader family of beings, some direct ancestors, some cousins, some side branches, some known only by fragments. The cave in South Africa is one doorway into that vanished breadth. It tells us that Africa was not simply producing one final form, it was holding a living diversity of forms, some with larger brains, some with smaller brains, some with bodies more familiar to us, some with bodies that seem to carry older and newer traits together. This is not a weakness in the story. It is the story becoming truer. The origin of humans was not a march across an empty stage. It was a slow, branching history inside real environments, where many populations tried to survive without knowing that one distant branch would someday look back and call itself the answer. Homo naledi does not answer everything about that beginning. It keeps the African landscape open, complex, and unfinished. The deeper we move into the African setting, the more carefully the word origin must be used. It can sound like a single point, as if humanity began in one place at one moment, from one small group that already carried the shape of everything to come. But the evidence for our beginnings points towards something broader and slower. Modern humans arose in Africa, yet Africa itself contained many landscapes and many populations. Over long spans of time, groups could separate, adapt, change, and sometimes reconnect. A face shape might shift in one region, a tool tradition might appear in another, a population might grow during a wetter period, then shrink or move when conditions became harsher. This does not make the story vague. It makes it biological. Real species do not emerge as clean ideas. They emerge through breeding populations, bodies, climates, distance, and generations. Homo naledi helps us feel this because it refuses to sit neatly beside a single straight origin line. It shows that while the roots of Homo sapiens were forming somewhere within this wider continental process, other human relatives could still exist with their own histories, their own limits, and their own endings. This wider view also protects us from a common mistake, thinking that every ancient human relative must be judged by how directly it leads to us. If a species is not our ancestor, we may be tempted to treat it as a side note, but side branches can reveal the shape of the whole tree. A cousin can show what the family once contained. Homo naledi may not belong on the direct path to modern humans, yet it tells us something vital about the world in which that path existed. It tells us that the human family was not reduced to one form as early or as neatly as many simple stories imply. It tells us that small-brained Homo, mosaic bodies, and late surviving lineages must be part of the landscape we imagine when we think about our own emergence. The origin of humans is therefore not only the origin of us, it is also the disappearance of others, the narrowing of possibilities, and the survival of one branch after many branches had lived real lives. In this way, Africa becomes not a stage but a living archive. Each fossil site preserves a different fragment of that archive. East African sites have long been central to the story because they preserve many early hominin remains and tools. Southern Africa, with its caves and limestone systems, preserves other kinds of evidence. North Africa has added important fossils that remind us modern human origins were not confined to one small region. The continent does not speak with one voice. It speaks through scattered remains, separated by distance and time. Homo naledi belongs to this scattered record. Its cave does not explain all of Africa, but it prevents us from making Africa too simple. It reminds us that gaps in the record are not empty spaces where nothing happened. They are places where things may have happened without leaving traces we have yet found. That thought matters for a calm and honest understanding of human beginnings. Our species did not appear as the only meaningful experiment in humanity. We appeared within a broader pattern of hominin diversity, where some relatives were close to us and others were more distant, where some may have overlapped in time without ever meeting, and where some disappeared so completely that only a handful of bones remain. Homo naledi is one of those reminders. Its presence in South Africa does not move the center of the entire human story into one cave. It does something more useful. It breaks the habit of searching for a single center too quickly. It asks us to imagine our origin as a wide, uneven field of populations and possibilities. In that field, the path to us was real, but it was not alone. Around it were other paths, some hidden in stone, some lost without record, and some still quietly changing the way we understand what a human beginning can mean. To understand Africa as the birthplace of humanity, we have to let it remain large. Not only large on a map, but large in time, in climate, in bodies, and in possibilities. A continent can hold many beginnings, without turning them all into one event. It can hold ancestors and cousins, old forms and newer forms, populations that meet and populations that never meet, lineages that leave descendants and lineages that leave only silence. Homo naledi belongs to that larger African depth. It does not replace the story of Homo sapiens. It does not move our direct origin into the cave. It does not need to do either of those things. Its importance is quieter. It shows that the African human past had more room than a straight road allows. Somewhere in that wide record, the ancestors of modern humans were changing through generations. Elsewhere, other human relatives may have been carrying different combinations of traits through their own worlds. The same continent could hold both the roots of us and the endings of others. That is not confusion. That is what a real evolutionary landscape looks like when it is not forced into a single line. Homo naledi also helps us see the danger of treating survival as the only measure of meaning. Modern humans survived, spread, and eventually became the only living human species. Because of that, every other branch can look incomplete from our point of view. But a vanished species was not living in order to become a lesson for us. It was living within its own pressures, with its own bodies, births, deaths, and generations. A side branch is not a failed ancestor. It is a real line of life that followed a different path until the path ended. This matters for the origin of humans because our beginning was surrounded by such paths. The human family did not become narrow because it was always narrow. It became narrow after other forms disappeared. Homo naledi, preserved in the cave, gives one shape to that lost breadth. The cave is not the whole archive, but it is a strong reminder that many pages are missing, and some pages survive only because stone protected them from complete erasure. When we look back from the present, we see one species asking questions about all the others. That position can create pride, but it can also create responsibility. The responsibility is to avoid making the past too obedient to our story. Africa was not waiting passively for modern humans to appear. It was changing, opening, closing, drying, greening, connecting, and separating populations across deep time. In such a world, evolution could produce variety without needing a single direction. A small-brained Homo in southern Africa could coexist in the broadest sense with other human developments elsewhere, even if no contact can be proven. A body with old and new traits could persist while other lineages change differently. A cave could preserve a trace that later generations would struggle to interpret. These are not dramatic claims. They are careful ways of letting the evidence widen the scene. This wider scene prepares us for a more honest view of ourselves. Our species is remarkable, but it is not separate from the branching history that produced and surrounded it. We carry the outcome of one surviving line, while the fossil record carries hints of many lines that did not continue. Homo naledi asks us to hold those two truths together. We came from Africa, but not from a simple corridor. We came from a deep population history, set among landscapes and relatives that make the word human larger than the living present. The cave species stands near the edge of that word, not as an answer, but as a quiet correction. It tells us that the road to us was real, yet the world around that road was wider, older, and filled with forms of humanity that time has almost taken away. The question of what makes a human becomes harder when Homo naledi is placed in the room. A simple answer would be comforting. We might say humans are defined by large brains, but the small brain case of this species weakens that line. We might say humans are defined by walking upright, but upright walking began long before modern people and was shared by other hominins. We might say humans are defined by tools, but tools do not always preserve clearly with bodies, and the absence of a tool beside a fossil is not the same as proof that no tool was ever used. We might say humans are defined by care for the dead, by symbols, by fire, or by language, but these are among the hardest things to prove deep in time. Homo naledi does not solve this problem. It makes the problem visible. It shows that the human family cannot be understood through one sign held above all others. It has to be approached through many signs at once, each limited, each useful, each incomplete. The body gives one layer, the cave gives another, the date gives another. The wider African setting gives another. Together, they do not form a simple answer, but they create a more honest question. In our own species, the word human feels complete because we live inside it. We do not need to measure ourselves every morning in order to belong to our kind. But when we look backward, the edges become less clear. Ancient relatives may share some features with us and lack others. Some may stand close to our ancestry. Others may be cousins, side branches, or forms whose relationships remain debated. The fossil record does not care about the names we prefer. It preserves bodies that lived before our categories existed. Homo naledi is important because it sits near the boundary where categories become uneasy. It belongs within the broader human group, yet it does not carry the full set of traits that many people casually associate with being human. This does not make it less real. It makes our definition less simple. The origin of humans, seen this way, is not the moment when one feature appeared and everything before became background. It is a long accumulation of changes, some anatomical, some behavioral, some social, some ecological, and many difficult to recover. A hand matters, a foot matters, a jaw, a tooth, a skull, a pelvis, a chamber, a layer of sediment, and a range of dates all matter. None of them alone can bear the entire weight. This may feel less satisfying than a single answer, but it is closer to the way life works. Evolution does not create definitions, it creates populations. Later, scientists examine remains and build careful names around them. Those names are necessary, but they should not trick us into thinking nature lived inside clean boxes. Homo naledi stands as a reminder that the human story was once full of forms that challenge our boxes. It asks us to think of humanity not as a switch that turned on, but as a field of overlapping traits, changing across bodies and generations. This also returns us to our own beginning, because Homo sapiens did not rise from emptiness. Our species emerged among relatives, inherited bodies, local environments, and deep time. The living human form is only one surviving arrangement from that broader history. Deep in the cave, the bones do not tell us exactly where to draw the final line. They ask whether the line itself has been too sharp. Perhaps to understand humans, we must stop searching for one golden feature and begin listening to the whole pattern. Body, brain, movement, place, time, and the silence around what cannot yet be known. A definition of human becomes stronger when it stops pretending to be a single doorway. Homo naledi teaches this quietly, because every doorway we try to use becomes too narrow. If we enter through the brain, the small brain case interrupts us. If we enter through the feet, other upright walkers come with us. If we enter through the hands, we find both grasping and questions about manipulation, but not a complete life. If we enter through the cave, we meet a powerful setting, yet not a final explanation. The species forces us to move from a simple definition toward a layered one. A human relative is not understood by one trait alone. but by the relationship among traits: anatomy, movement, development, environment, time, and the pattern of remains. This is harder to say in a short phrase, but it is closer to the truth. The origin of humans was never a clean border where one kind of creature ended and another began. It was a long field of change, with bodies becoming different in uneven ways across generations. The living world makes categories feel solid because only Homo sapiens remains. We can point to ourselves and say, human with no confusion in everyday life. But deep history is not everyday life. It contains forms that are near to us in some ways and distant in others. Homo naledi is one of those forms. It shows that the word human, when carried backward into the fossil record, becomes less like a wall and more like a region with blurred edges. This does not mean that anything can be called human. It means the evidence must be read carefully, with comparisons across many bodies and sites. Scientists do not place a fossil in the human family because it feels mysterious. They compare teeth, skulls, limbs, hands, feet, proportions, and relationships to other known fossils. They ask how traits cluster, how old the remains may be, and what the broader pattern suggests. Even then, disagreement can remain, because ancient life does not always fit modern labels smoothly. This difficulty is not a failure of science. It is a sign that the past was real before it became organized by our names. Homo naledi also reminds us that behavior cannot be used carelessly as the final test. Modern humans often define themselves through behavior: language, memory, teaching, art, burial, tools, and shared meaning. These are central to our species, but they are difficult to trace in deep time. A stone tool may survive without the maker's body. A body may survive without tools. A cave may preserve remains without preserving intention. The absence of evidence can be misleading, and the presence of suggestive evidence can be overread. This is why the question of what makes a human must remain patient. It must listen to bones without asking them to speak more than they can. It must listen to context without turning every unusual place into a modern story. It must listen to time without assuming later always means more like us. When all these layers are held together, Homo naledi becomes less of a contradiction and more of a lesson. It shows that humanity was not born as a complete package. Our own species carries one outcome of a much wider history, but that history included relatives with different balances of traits. Some were closer to our ancestry, some were probably side branches, some may never be fully understood. The cave species stands among them, asking us to replace pride with attention. To ask what makes a human is not only to ask what separates us from other life, it is also to ask what connects us to vanished forms that shared part of our deep inheritance. In that connection, the old definition becomes quieter, broader, and more careful. Homo naledi brings the question of humanity to a quiet threshold. On one side is the comfort of definition. On the other side is the fossil record, where bodies rarely obey the borders we draw for them. A large brain cannot stand alone as the answer, because this species seems to belong within the wider human family while carrying a small brain case. Upright walking cannot stand alone, because walking on two legs reaches deep into hominin history and does not belong only to us. Hands cannot stand alone, because grasping, climbing, and possible manipulation may appear in combinations that do not reveal a complete way of life. The cave cannot stand alone, because a difficult setting may suggest behavior without proving the meaning behind it. Each clue is real, but each clue is partial. The lesson is not that the word human has no meaning. The lesson is that its deep history was made from overlapping traits, not from one bright line. This matters because modern humans often understand themselves from the inside outward. We begin with consciousness, memory, language, family, and the feeling of being a person. Then we look backward and search for the first moment when that inner world must have appeared. But fossils do not preserve inner worlds. They preserve bone, position, wear, breakage, shape, and sometimes association with other traces. To study origins honestly, we must reverse our instinct. We must begin not with the modern mind, but with the ancient body. We must ask what the feet show, what the hands allow, what the skull suggests, what the teeth preserve, what the cave can and cannot explain, Homo naledi is valuable because it keeps all these questions open at once. It does not let one answer become ruler over all the others. In that sense, it changes not only what we think about one species, but how we think about the human family as a whole. A family can contain direct ancestors, distant cousins, side branches, and lost forms that do not fit neatly into a modern sense of identity. The fact that only Homo sapiens survives today makes the old diversity easy to forget. The living world gives us a single example, and a single example can make the past look simpler than it was. Homo naledi interrupts that simplicity. It shows that a human relative could be near enough to matter and strange enough to unsettle the categories we use. It asks us to hold connection and difference together, without turning either into a final answer. The origin of humans becomes more truthful when seen through this difficulty. It was not the sudden arrival of a perfect package called humanity. It was a long history of changing bodies, divided populations, local environments, inherited traits, and vanished experiments. Some traits that feel central to us may have deep roots. Others may have appeared later or changed in ways the fossil record only partly reveals. Some relatives may have shared parts of the human pattern while lacking other parts that we consider essential. This does not make them less worthy of study. It makes them essential to the study of ourselves, because they show the space around our own emergence. Deep inside the cave, Homo naledi does not hand us a new definition carved in stone. It removes confidence from old definitions that were too narrow. It tells us that to understand humans, we must study not only the features that survived in us, but also the features that survived for a time in others and then disappeared. The cave species stands as a reminder that humanity was once a wider condition than the present world can show. What makes a human, in deep time, may not be one feature at all, but a pattern held briefly in living bodies, then partly lost, partly preserved, and still only partly understood. Evolution is often told as a story of gain. Brains grow larger, hands become more capable, feet carry bodies farther, tools become sharper, fire is controlled, language deepens, memory stretches across generations. From the present, these gains are easy to see because we live inside their result. But every gain hides another side of the story: loss. The human family did not only move toward us, it also lost forms of life that once existed in the world. Some branches disappeared after long survival. Some may have been small and vulnerable from the beginning. Some are known from only a few bones, and some may never be known at all. Homo naledi stands near this quiet side of evolution. Its bones do not show a creature becoming modern. They show a branch that carried its own body through time and then ended, leaving no living descendants we can point to. That ending does not mean the species failed in any simple moral sense. Evolution has no scoreboard. It has only populations, environments, reproduction, chance, and time. This matters for the origin of humans, because our own survival can make the past look as if it was always moving toward us. But the cave species reminds us that many human possibilities were cut away before the present became narrow. To understand humanity honestly, we must look not only at what was gained in our line, but also at what vanished around it. A small brain combined with human-like feet, a hand that carried older curves, a body that preserved an unexpected balance of traits, a population represented by many bones in a hidden chamber. These are not just curiosities. They are signs of a world in which being human, or near human, could take more than one form. Modern humans did not inherit all those forms. We inherited only our own body, our own brain, our own path, and perhaps the genetic traces of some relatives. Where evidence exists, other branches left no living body behind. Their ways of moving, growing, sensing, and surviving ended with them. The cave makes that loss feel physical. It is not an abstract disappearance. It is bone in stone, darkness around remains, silence where a population once had breath. This is not meant to create sadness for its own sake. It is meant to restore scale. The human story is larger than the success of one species, because that success stands among many endings. Homo naledi asks us to imagine evolution not as a ladder rising into light, but as a tree in which most branches do not reach the present. Some branches break early, some extend for a time, then stop. Some leave marks strong enough to be found, others vanish without even that. Our own branch survived, but survival does not make every other branch meaningless. In fact, their absence helps explain why the living world feels so simple now. There is only us, and because there is only us, we easily forget that the word human once had a wider shadow. Homo naledi gives part of that shadow back. It shows that the deep past contained bodies that were neither fully like us nor wholly outside our family. It shows that a species can matter even when it does not lead forward into us. The beginning of humanity, seen through this loss, becomes less proud and more careful. We are not the inevitable center of everything that came before. We are the surviving witness to a history that removed many other witnesses. Deep inside the cave, the bones are not only evidence of anatomy or age, they are evidence that evolution preserves some questions by erasing the lives that could have answered them. What remains is not a complete record, but a quiet boundary, where knowledge meets loss and learns to speak more gently about origins and about the silence before us. Loss in evolution is rarely dramatic while it is happening. A population does not vanish in one clear moment that later generations can easily mark. It may become smaller over many generations. Births may become fewer. Groups may become separated. A dry period, a shift in food, a blocked route, disease, competition, or simple bad luck may press on a fragile lineage until its future narrows beyond recovery. For Homo naledi, we do not know the final cause of disappearance. The fossil record does not preserve that last season. It does not tell us whether the end came quickly or slowly, whether the population was already small or whether several pressures gathered over time. What we can say is more restrained and more useful. This species existed, carried a distinctive body, and is no longer here. That absence is part of human history. It tells us that the family from which we study ourselves was not only a family of origins, but also a family of endings. The cave makes this easier to feel because it preserves presence inside disappearance. Bones remain where breath is gone. Shape remains where movement is gone. A skull remains where a living mind, whatever its nature, can no longer be reached. In that sense, Homo naledi teaches a cold lesson about the beginning of humans. Our origin was not only the accumulation of traits that survived in us, it was also the removal of other arrangements of body and life that once shared the wider human world. Homo with feet suited to upright movement is not a mistake in the record. It is evidence that evolution tried more than the version that later became ours. The word tried should not be understood as intention. Nature was not planning alternatives. Populations simply lived under conditions, and some combinations continued for a time, others ended. From the present, the ending can look like failure, but that is a human judgment placed on a process without human purpose. A lineage may disappear after existing for many generations. During those generations, it was not incomplete. It was alive. It had young and old. It had bodies growing and wearing down. It had daily pressures we can only approach through bone and landscape. When we remember this, Homo naledi becomes more than a strange discovery. It becomes a reminder that the past was full of complete lives that did not need to become us in order to matter. This changes the emotional meaning of human uniqueness. If we say modern humans are unique, we should say it carefully. We are unique today because no other human species remains beside us, but that lonely position is the result of disappearance, not proof that the world was always meant to contain only one human form. The fossil record shows that the human family once had more breadth. Some relatives were close enough to leave traces in our ancestry. Others may have been side branches with no known contribution to our line. Homo naledi appears to belong to this wider field of lost relatives, important not because it leads directly into us, but because it shows what the field once contained. The cave, therefore, becomes a quiet classroom in humility. It teaches that the surviving branch does not own the meaning of the whole tree. It teaches that bodies can be unfamiliar and still belong near our story. It teaches that loss is not outside evolution, but one of its deepest patterns. When we look toward the origin of humans from this angle, the question changes. We no longer ask only how we became what we are. We also ask what kinds of humanity disappeared before the present world grew silent enough for us to mistake survival for inevitability. The losses hidden inside evolution are not only losses of species, they are losses of possible ways to be human. Homo naledi gives that thought a body. It shows us feet that bring the creature near the long ground path of our family, hands that still hold older questions, a small brain that refuses to match a simple rule, and a cave setting that keeps behavior just beyond firm conclusion. Taken together, these traces do not tell us that our understanding of humanity should be thrown away. They tell us that it should be widened. There was never only one way for a human relative to exist. There were bodies adapted to different landscapes, populations shaped by different pressures, and lineages that continued for reasons we may never fully recover. When one of those lineages disappeared, the world lost more than a name. It lost a whole arrangement of movement, growth, perception, survival, and relationship to place. The origin of humans becomes deeper when these lost arrangements are allowed to matter. Our own line gained many things: larger and more complex brains, expanding culture, flexible tools, symbolic memory, and eventually the power to record the past in language. But gain is not the whole story. While one line gained, others ended. Their endings removed evidence, narrowed diversity, and left modern humans standing alone where once there had been a wider family. Homo naledi stands as one of those removed possibilities. Its body was not waiting to become modern. It was not a rough draft of us. It was a real form of life with its own evolutionary balance. That balance may look strange from the present because the present has become too narrow to prepare us for it. Only one human species remains, and that single survival makes other forms look more surprising than they may have been in their own time. The cave gives this loss a quiet shape. It does not show a crowd of vanished humans moving across the land. It shows what remains after movement is gone. It gives bones without breath, anatomy without daily life, a chamber without the sounds that once belonged to living bodies. This is why Homo naledi feels so important for a calm and honest history. It does not ask us to invent a lost world beyond evidence. It asks us to notice how little of that world could survive. A fossil is not the past itself. It is a remnant that escaped destruction. For every bone found, countless bones were broken, scattered, dissolved, or never preserved. For every species named, other populations may have left no trace at all. Human origins, therefore, are built from both evidence and absence. The absence should make us careful, not empty. It should remind us that certainty must be earned slowly. As the story moves toward its final questions, the loss of Homo naledi becomes less like an ending and more like a lesson. Evolution did not protect every human form. It did not preserve every branch because each branch was meaningful to us. It allowed life to continue where conditions allowed, and to disappear where they did not. Modern humans are not outside that rule. We are not the answer that evolution had in mind from the beginning. We are one surviving outcome of a long, branching process filled with bodies that lived fully and then vanished. Deep inside the cave, Homo naledi leaves a trace of that larger truth. It teaches that to understand ourselves, we must look not only at what led to us, but also at what did not. The lost branches do not weaken the human story. They make it more honest, more humble, and more complete. At the end of this long path, the cave still does not give back a simple answer. It gives bones, a chamber, a body, a date range, and a set of questions that have become more careful with each step. Homo naledi began for us as something found in darkness, but the darkness was never the whole point. The real difficulty is that the species makes several familiar ideas less certain at the same time. It weakens the idea that brain size alone defines the human family. It weakens the idea that later always means more modern. It weakens the idea that Africa was a single road leading directly and only to us. It also weakens the habit of turning every unusual trace into a dramatic claim before the evidence is ready. What remains is not emptiness. What remains is a better kind of attention. The cave teaches that human origins are not understood by forcing the past to answer quickly. They are understood by letting each trace keep its proper weight. A foot can show movement, but not a whole life. A hand can show possibility, but not every action. A skull can show shape and size, but not a living mind. A chamber can show location, but not intention by itself. When these limits are respected, Homo naledi becomes more, not less, meaningful. It becomes a guide to the humility that good science requires. This humility matters because the story of human origins is also the story of how modern humans learn to see themselves. We are a species that asks where we came from, and the question is never only biological. It touches identity, memory, pride, fear, and the quiet knowledge that we are the only humans left. That loneliness can make us want the past to be clear. We may want every fossil to line up behind us, every branch to point toward us, every vanished relative to become either ancestor or failure. Homo naledi refuses that arrangement. It does not stand behind us like a direct beginning, and it does not disappear into meaninglessness because it was not our ancestor. It stands beside the road, in the wider landscape, showing that the human family once contained forms that our present world no longer prepares us to imagine. The cave leaves unanswered questions, but those questions have value. They protect us from thinking that knowledge is only useful when it is complete. In real science, an unanswered question can be a form of progress if it is clearer than the question that came before. Before Homo naledi, many people could still picture human evolution as a line that became steadily smarter, taller, and more familiar. After this discovery, that picture becomes harder to hold without revision. The beginning of humanity appears more branched, more uneven, more patient, and more fragile. It includes bodies that did not lead to us, minds we cannot reconstruct, movements we can only infer, and deaths whose meaning remains beyond reach. This is not a failure of the story. It is what makes the story honest. It also gives the listener something useful beyond the cave itself. A truthful history can be calming because it does not demand false certainty. It allows the mind to rest near evidence, near limits, and near questions that do not need to be solved tonight. As we return one last time to the entrance of the cave, the surface light feels different. Above ground, modern humans continue to speak, remember, measure, and ask. Below ground, the bones remain silent but not empty. They remind us that our knowledge grows by listening to silence without filling it too quickly. They remind us that the past does not exist to flatter the present. And they remind us that being human may begin not with certainty, but with the willingness to remain careful before what we do not yet know. The unanswered questions around Homo naledi are not empty spaces in the story. They are places where the story becomes more responsible. A simple tale would be easy to finish. It would say that the cave proves one dramatic behavior, or that the small brain proves one narrow limit, or that the strange body proves everything we thought about humans was wrong. But a useful history must be calmer than that. It must say what the evidence can carry, and it must stop when the evidence stops. This is not a weakness. It is the reason the story can be trusted. The bones from Rising Star do not need to become a myth in order to matter. They matter because they show a real branch of the human family that does not fit our old habits of thought. They matter because they teach us that a body can preserve several evolutionary histories at once. They matter because they place many individuals in a difficult underground setting that continues to demand careful explanation. They matter because they show that the origin of humans was wider than the single surviving species now looking back. For the listener, this is perhaps the most useful lesson. The past is not made more valuable by pretending to know more than we do. It is made more valuable by learning how to live with honest limits. Modern life often pushes the mind toward quick certainty. A headline wants an answer. A title wants a shock. A story wants a conclusion. But the cave resists that speed. It asks for a different rhythm, one closer to sleep, stone, and deep time. In that rhythm, a question can remain open without becoming useless. A mystery can remain unsolved without becoming imaginary. Homo naledi becomes a quiet teacher of proportion. It tells us that the human story is large enough to include evidence, disagreement, wonder, and restraint in the same breath. This lesson reaches beyond one species. It changes how we think about ourselves. Modern humans are not the final sentence written at the top of a straight page. We are the living remnant of a branching history. Our bodies carry ancient inheritances. Our minds carry new capacities built on older foundations. Our species became powerful, but power does not erase kinship with what came before. The feet that walk through cities still belong to a lineage shaped by ground, distance, and balance. The hands that write, repair, touch, and build still belong to a deeper history of grasping, carrying, and reaching. The brain that asks about the cave is not separate from the body that made such asking possible. Homo naledi reminds us of this continuity without making us identical to it. It was not us. It was not simply before us. It was near the human story in its own way, and that is enough to make it important. The educational value of the discovery lies in this careful widening of the mind. We learn that evolution is not a ladder of worth. We learn that survival is not proof of greater moral value. We learn that extinction is not the same as failure. We learn that the human family once held forms, now absent from the earth. And we learn that scientific honesty is not cold because it refuses exaggeration. It is respectful because it allows the dead to remain what the evidence shows them to be, rather than making them speak words they never left behind. Deep inside the cave, Homo naledi still holds back more than it gives. Yet what it gives is enough to change the question. It asks us not only what this species was, but what kind of listeners we become when the past answers slowly. Perhaps the deepest lesson is that human origins are not a possession to be claimed, but a silence to be approached with patience, care, and humility. The cave leaves us with a final kind of knowledge, one that is quieter than certainty. Homo naledi does not allow us to say that everything once believed about humans was false. It asks for something more careful, that the story be made larger. A small brain did not keep this species outside the human family. Human-like feet did not make it simply modern. Curved fingers and older body traits did not make it merely primitive. A deep chamber with many bones did not give a complete explanation of behavior, yet it refused to behave like an ordinary discovery. Each fact stands beside the others, and none of them can be allowed to rule alone. This is what the cave teaches in the end. Human origins are not a single answer waiting under the ground. They are a pattern of traces, some clear, some broken, some still hidden, and some already lost forever. To listen honestly to that pattern is to become more patient with our own beginning. Modern humans often search the past for a mirror. We want to know when we began to look like ourselves, think like ourselves, care like ourselves, and separate ourselves from the rest of life. But the deeper record does not give the mirror back so easily. It gives relatives, not reflections. It gives bodies that shared part of our inheritance while carrying forms we no longer carry. It gives branches that lived without becoming us. Homo naledi is one of those branches. Its value is not that it explains us completely, but that it prevents us from explaining ourselves too simply. It reminds us that the word human has a history wider than the living world now shows. It reminds us that our species became alone only after other human forms disappeared. And it reminds us that the silence of those forms is not empty, because silence can still change how we think. There is a gentle lesson here for anyone listening in the dark. The truth does not always arrive as a finished sentence. Sometimes it arrives as a careful limit. We know enough to say that Homo naledi was a real member of a wider human story. We know enough to say that its body challenges a straight ladder of progress. We know enough to say that the cave setting remains one of the most important and debated parts of the discovery. But we do not know enough to give the species a modern mind, a clear ritual, or a simple place on the road to us. That boundary is not disappointing. It is the place where respect begins. We respect the evidence by not forcing it. We respect the vanished species by not turning it into a symbol too quickly. We respect ourselves by admitting that knowledge grows more slowly than wonder. It asks us to rest with uncertainty, not as ignorance, but as the quiet ground from which every careful understanding of human origins must slowly begin again tonight, gently. If there is a message to carry out of the cave, it is this: being human is not made smaller by discovering that humanity was once wider. It becomes deeper. Our origin is not only a record of what survived in us, but also a record of what disappeared around us. The bones in Rising Star do not speak, yet they have changed the question. They show that the past was patient, branching, and unfinished long before we arrived to name it. So when we imagine that narrow chamber one last time, hidden beneath stone, holding a species both near and distant, perhaps the most honest ending is not an answer, but the same open question with which the cave still waits. If Homo naledi could exist so close to the edge of what we call human, how much of our own beginning remains unseen in the dark?